Um, Thank you to the board members, HRSA, our contract support team, and the members of the public that are joining us today for the July 16th OPTN board meeting. As you all recall, it's an open meeting. Next slide. So first, we're going to go ahead and call for a quorum. Is the link in the chat yet or no?
I'm sorry, the link is in the chat now. I ask all board members to click on the link and acknowledge your presence. Dr. McGee, we have reached quorum.
Just finish mine. Okay, great. Next slide. So again, just to remember, this is an open meeting. The first part of the meeting is open meeting. Please engage as much as possible. Turn your video on if possible. Keep your microphone on mute unless you're speaking. This session is being recorded. Closed captioning is available if you prefer. And please use the raise hand function to ask questions during the Q&A or open discussion, and reserve the use of the chat function for technical issues. Next slide. So this is our agenda for today. We're going to approve the prior meeting summaries. That's a voting action. There's going to be an update for the work done by the DCD work group, which was in response to an OPTN directive to the OPTN to develop or add specific elements to the DCD policy. That's informational. We'll have some other opportunity for other business, and then the board will move into closed session. Next. So the first item is approval of the minutes from both and we'll do these in two steps. The first order of business will be to approve the meeting summaries from the June 5th OPTN board meeting. So there's a motion here.
Second.
Thanks. Great. Thanks, Bill and Ken. We go ahead and add that to the chat.
The voting link has been added to the chat. If I can ask all board members to click the link now and vote.
And again, as a reminder, if you were not present, it's fine. Abstaining is appropriate.
I'm just waiting for the vote count. The June 5th summary was approved, 24 approved, 0 reject, 1 abstain.
Thank you. All right. The next item will be the resolution for the June 18th board summary. Again, if you were not present, please abstain.
Motion.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks. Thank you.
All right, that link has been added. I ask again if board members click on the link to vote. I'm just waiting on the final count. The motion has carried, 23 approved, 0 reject, and 3 abstain. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. So next slide. So the next item for the board's consideration, or actually information, is the work that's been done by the DCD OPO work group and the OPO committee. The HRSA had issued a directive asking for policy changes within the DCD policy. That work group worked for several months. It worked with the OPO committee as well. The board approved release of the proposal for public comment in December of 2025. Since then, the committee has been working and reviewing, adjudicating the public comments and finalized its recommendations. The red line version of the policy was included in advance for the materials for today's meeting. And again, you will see that in the final meeting or next month where we plan to vote on it. We, in discussion with the people working on it, we thought it would be worthwhile to present it ahead of time, socialize the ideas, and also provide the work group committee with some time to develop some implementation materials, including an implementation plan, which we think will help with moving the policy into effective action, because policy without action isn't really useful. So with that, I'm going to invite PJ Garrity, who's the immediate past chair of the OPO committee, to walk us through the final recommendations, answer questions, and continue to inform the board. So PJ, thank you. And I just want to give PJ a shout out for both his work on the OPO committee, this DCD OPO work group, as well as his work with the NRP work group. So PJ. And hopefully PJ's on.
Yeah, I do see him. Let me just see. We don't hear you though, PJ. Oh, there you go. I saw.
How about now? Is this working?
There you are.
Okay.
Loud and clear.
Zoom is fun. Okay, well, we'll go to the next slide, please. Thank you, Dr. McGee, for your kind words. It was a large group effort, and I'm hoping that the board will be pleased with our efforts, and we'll be able to move this forward. So we did review the themes, the different themes of the public comments that was done on March 18th, and we identified whether there were additional policy language changes warranted, or revisions, clarifications, or sometimes a rationale for no change. So we provided some further feedback and review on March 30th, and the OPO committee approved the policy to go for the board vote on June 25th. And so we're here today as kind of an informational update, and then at the August board meeting, it should go for a vote. Next slide, please. So we did add a definition about the unplanned DCD pause and its intent. And so this is an unexpected suspension of the DCD process due to an unresolved difference of opinion as to whether a patient meets the donor's criteria for withdrawal of life-sustaining therapy. An unplanned DCD pause is not intended to address issues or questions related to authorization for donation. And so this is, to be a little bit clearer, the unresolved is probably the key part of this phrase, which is to say that if someone identifies a reason or a concern about a patient who perhaps should not undergo withdrawal of therapy, and all of the team members agree and no one objects, then there's not an unresolved difference of opinion, and this is not a reportable pause, if you will. So I know that was a concern that some OPOs had expressed, that if there were any changes in the process or concerns about a patient not meeting withdrawal criteria, that we would have to report each of those changes, and that is not the intent of the policy. Next slide, please. Section 2.2 OPO responsibilities clarifies the scope of the OPO responsibility with regard to educating stakeholders for requesting a pause. And so the OPO is required to inform all stakeholders involved in the process about the process for requesting an unplanned pause in accordance with the policy that's there. The stakeholders include the patient or the patient's agent, the donor hospital staff, OPO staff, and third-party procurement preservation staff operating on behalf of the OPO. Next slide, please. This talks about the OPO responsibility regarding neurologic assessments. This is 2.2, item 8. Accurate documentation of neurological assessment. If there's discordance between OPO and patient care team assessments, there's got to be appropriate escalation within the OPO. So the original version of this implied that the OPO was the one responsible for doing the patient assessments. That, of course, should be the role of the patient care team. The OPO is documenting those and identifying any significant discrepancies. Next slide, please. This section 2.15.d.2 talks about the notification of the process for a pause. And so at the time of the authorization, the OPO will inform the patient, if applicable, or the patient's agent of the process for requesting a DCD pause. Each OPO must establish and document a process by which the OPO will inform stakeholders, as defined earlier at 227, involved in each case, how to request an unplanned DCD pause at no fewer than 2 time points. So the 2 time points where the OPO will be responsible for informing stakeholders is within 2 hours of case initiation. And then the second time is at the timeout prior to initiating the withdrawal of life-sustaining therapies, as defined at 2.15H. Only those stakeholders involved in the case at the time of the case initiation and timeout prior to initiating withdrawal of life-sustaining therapies are required to be informed. So this limits the scope, if you will, a little bit of whom the OPO needs to educate in real time about the DCD pause process. And it clarifies exactly which groups of people those would be. Next slide, please. In 2.15F, OPTN members are required to do education for their staff. So all OPTN members must educate their applicable staff and contracted third parties involved in organ offer triage and acceptance on policy 2.15.D, policy or process for unplanned pause, and 2.15.E, response to a request for an unplanned pause. This education must be documented and verified. And so what this means is that the OPO is not going to be the one responsible for training other OPTN member staff or third-party vendors contracted by other OPTN member staff who might be involved in the offer screening, acceptance, recovery, any of those parts. OPTN members are expected to identify which of their staff members are involved in the DCD process and need to know about the process for a pause. Next slide, please. For organ recovery, obviously there's a mandated waiting period. For the first time, we are standardizing that waiting period of no less than 5 minutes of circulatory cessation to ensure that no auto-resuscitation occurs unless the recovery is made pursuant to policy 2.15.JL, brain dead donors recovered using DCD protocols. So those are unusual circumstances where at a family request, we may have a patient who was appropriately and correctly pronounced brain dead, but whose family request organ recovery take place under DCD protocols. That 5-minute time period is not required for those circumstances. For all other circumstances, there's a minimum minimum interval between circulatory cessation and the beginning of recovery, minimum interval of 5 minutes. Right now, that process varies around the country, mostly 5 minutes, but in some cases as short as 2 or 3. 5 minutes will be the minimum. Next slide, please. We also updated required reporting by OPOs to clarify the timing of the reporting requirement for an unplanned DCD pause. And so the original language made it seem that you'd have to report the outcome of a pause before you would have to report the pause itself. And so what we created was the pause that they have to notify the OPTN of the pause within 72 hours of the initiation or within 24 hours of the resolution of the pause, whichever occurs first. And so as an example, today is Thursday. It's about 10:15 in the morning where I am. If we had a pause on a DCD case this afternoon, we would have until Thursday, Friday, Sunday at 10:15 to report it. However, if we resolved it tomorrow morning, we would have until Saturday morning and the same 24 hours later to report it. So I hope that was clear. Next slide, please. And so now we'll be happy to have some discussion or take questions or.
Thanks, PJ. So just to remind everyone, this was initiated under HRSA HHS directive to address several issues, including kind of the timeout mechanism, establishing parameters around that, engagement with the local hospital staff, And also it incorporated the 5-minute recommendation, which had been a presidential direct or educational note to the community. So this is a big step forward in many components of it. Concurrently with this, and some of the public comments reflected this, NRP is a separate pathway that's being integrated into this policy development. So the NRP work group is continuing to work. Hopefully, we'll have some materials ready to present in the next meeting or two for board awareness. But that's why it's the policy. The components of it that are more silent on the NRP. A lot of this policy change was meant to direct to clarify things like the timeout and engagement with the hospital staff, et cetera. And the group did a great job of kind of clarifying some of the responsibilities in a more specific way rather than the previous language, which left more to interpretation. So with that, I'll open it up for questions from the board.
I see Dan first, then Alan.
Sorry,
Sure.
the hands.
Okay. No,
Go
thanks.
ahead.
Thanks. PJ, thanks for this great overview and all your work on this. The question I had is, how will this be audited, like in that section 2.15.D.2? Like, how will those time periods be audited at the different sites?
So to be clear, this is the 2 points at which the OPO trains
Yeah.
stakeholders.
Yeah, the neuro assessments, those 2 time
Okay.
periods.
So the neuro assessments are captured in the OPO donor record, and so we'll be expecting those within the required timeframes, and then the education points, the OPO will document in the donor record that they provided education to the stakeholders at those points. So that'll be on a case-by-case basis, as well as required within the OPO policy. So from an auditing perspective, auditors would look to see that the OPO has a policy regarding education and neurological assessments for these 2 items, and then to look in donor charts to ensure that the policy was followed appropriately.
Great, thank you.
Alan.
Thanks, John. PJ, great work. And I apologize for not knowing the rest of the policy as well as I should, other than what the comment responses that you talked about. But is there part of the policy that addresses what should occur during the pause? We hear about instances where third-party procurement folks walk out of the room or haven't taken part in the resolution. Is there prescriptive or descriptive verbiage about what should happen during the pause and how it gets resolved? Thank you.
Thanks. To be clear, you're talking about not the wait for the 5-minute interval between cessation of circulation. You're talking about an unresolved pause.
Yes, an unplanned pause.
So that is to be worked out basically between the issue is brought forward by whoever brings it forward. The OPO notifies the hospital, and then the hospital and the OPO and the donor family will collaborate together to figure out what's the circumstance and whether there's a concern for withdrawal being inappropriate. And then the hospital and family are the ones who drive that, really. The OPO and the other OPTN members are not involved in the decision to withdraw support. And at that point, it would be if the hospital and family determine that moving forward with withdrawal of support is appropriate, then the OPO will have to make a decision as to whether they would choose to continue to participate in the recovery.
So for clarity, I guess I'm talking about in the operating room.
So the same circumstance, we would that in the operating room, that would presumably be a circumstance where the donor is exhibiting signs of life. In that circumstance, the patient care team is notified and brought back if they have left, which they shouldn't have left. There should be someone there until the patient is declared dead completely, if you will. But the patient care team is notified, and the patient immediately returns to the patient care team's care.
Thanks.
Thanks, Alan. Sam?
I have a lot of questions, but I'll keep it brief. I guess, PJ, one, I would say I think it's great the 5-minute waiting period is defined. I think that's long overdue. And I also think having a defined pathway for a DBD, DCD also long overdue. So great job by the committee on that. I think for me in reviewing the policy where the initial statement is calling a pause an unresolved difference of opinion as to whether a patient meets the donor hospital's criteria for withdrawal of life-sustaining treatments. Do we know that hospitals are required to have criteria for this? Because in my experience, it's the judgment of the attending physician and the decision making by a donor family. And so for an OPO to at multiple time points be responsible for confirming the patient meets the hospital's criteria, I would want to confirm that criteria exist uniformly across donor hospitals. Otherwise, we're setting up a requirement that OPOs can't meet and we can't audit.
So I would say that you're right, there are some hospitals that have criteria and many that do not. And in that case, the criteria is the physician and family judgment. And it would just be checking in with the physician and family. Has there been a change? Are you still comfortable with moving forward with withdrawal of life-sustaining therapy?
Is there a reason that can't just be the baseline of the OPO confirms with the attending and the family at those two critical time points that everyone is in agreement? Because, it also talks about how the decision to withdraw life-sustaining treatment should not be influenced by the donation decision. And I worry we're creating a pathway where the donation decision now impacts the decision to withdraw life-sustaining treatments, which really lies with the treating team and the family. And a surgeon who shows up in the OR at the 11th hour maybe has never seen this patient, but sees a list of neuroreflexes and has, their own judgment, not based on caring directly for this patient. I worry we're going to derail patients' end-of-life experiences in a way that is harmful to patients without much payoff in terms of patient safety. Because if the OPO walks away, that patient still has withdrawal of life-sustaining treatments. All that happens is when they die, no one gets a transplant.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best we can hope for is to have the hospital and the patient care team and the patient family, reevaluate, saying, if someone has raised this question, is there a concern? And then they come back and say, no, we're aware of whatever that circumstance is. We don't have a concern.
I would recommend that be codified in policy just for the purposes of OPOs being held accountable to this policy. I don't know how they can be held accountable when we don't know those policies exist.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, where the policy exists, it's the policy that they follow. Where there isn't a policy, the effective policy is the physician and family decision that it's appropriate to move forward.
And certainly some of that can also be codified in the implementation interpretive guideline component of it too. Specifically, if there's not you can't follow a policy that's not there. So I think good point. I think Darren is next.
Yeah, PJ, thanks for presenting this and carrying this forward. I agree with Sam's comments and her assessment. I think the last time I had asked some questions around things like, we don't have auto resuscitation actually documented. There seems to be some confusion around what would constitute as that. I found it interesting, the documentation related to the neurological assessment. We kind of just moved where the word accuracy was. And maybe I'm reading not enough into it or too much into it. But what is the intent of that, of what we're describing? The intent of the hospital accurately documenting it? Is it our accuracy in transcribing it? Is it that we agree with what their assessment is, even though this is not something that we would perform?
I think it's based on the concerns from the cases in the past where the patient was not well assessed by the hospital or not well reassessed, and people didn't identify changes in the patient's neurostatus that were found to be concerning later on. And so the intent here is to guide the hospital towards reassessing the patient's neurostatus on a regular basis. I think the policy calls for it every 12 hours at least, and then 2 hours before the withdrawal of life-sustaining therapy. And so the intent is to ensure that the hospital is doing that and that the findings are not changed enough that withdrawals of life-sustaining therapy might be inappropriate.
Yeah, and I think that is absolutely directionally appropriate, because it can't just be that somebody consents to donation and then 2 days later, there's a withdrawal and we're all of a sudden surprised by something. But I would want to make sure that the language is something that is enforceable, that it's auditable and it's clear about what the expectation is. And if we're going to be held accountable to this, abundantly clear about how we'd be held accountable and to what criteria. The other question I would have is we have a couple of different components of the updated or the list of stakeholders. But then if you go down to 215E, it still indicates that when we determine that it can proceed or it can resume, we must obtain acknowledgement prior to organ recovery from all transplant programs that accept an organ from the donor. What does that look like?
So that's basically to ensure that anybody accepting an organ from the donor knows that there was an unplanned pause that took place and what the resolution of that pause was. So even if they weren't necessarily involved at the time of that the pause occurred, it's important that they are aware that it occurred and what were the circumstances and how it was resolved.
So is this something that would occur at the end of a case, or would it relate to provisional acceptances or primary offers? Who would be those individuals? And then what would acknowledgement actually look like?
As to what it would look like, I mean, I think that could be done in any number of ways. It could just be a verbal acknowledgement, presumably documented in the OPO record. I spoke to so and so at Transplant Center, advised them of the circumstances, and they acknowledged. It could be a reply to an email. I think the OPOs could determine how they wanted to do that. As to when, or I guess your question was when would those folks be notified? It would be at the time of well, it would depend on when the organ offer occurred in relation to the pause. So let's say that the pause occurred before any organ offers were initiated, then sort of with each organ offer, the team would be notified that this had occurred just as part of the donor's course. If the pause occurred later than that, after an organ had been accepted, the accepting team would be notified of what occurred and given an opportunity, I suppose, to withdraw their acceptance if they chose to do so.
Okay. So in practice, this would be as we send out offers, if it's after the event, every single offer we send out, we would be notifying those centers, those coordinators, to let them know a pause had occurred and this was the resolution.
Yeah, and I think that's something that could be put in the OPTN donor data matching system, like donor highlights or something like that, to have a consistent message across all people receiving the offer.
And I think that if you took that approach, we might get our hands slapped because this is suggesting that we require an acknowledgement from each center. So every time we're sending out offers, and that's my concern is that language was untouched and it still doesn't seem like it's clear on how we could accomplish that and to what extent this should be communicated. Meaning, if it's every single time somebody has a provisional yes, that's very different than if it's the accepting center or the centers that were involved who are going to be sending a team. So I would encourage us to think differently or consider another way we could explain that or contemplate a mechanism where that can be incorporated in the actual matching system so it's streamlined, it's consistent every single time.
So looking in the public comment proposal version that I have here, line 151, I think says any must obtain acknowledgement prior to organ recovery from all transplant programs that accept an organ from the donor. So ultimately, we would only have to document acknowledgement from those centers that accepted an organ. So it's not all 600 centers that received an offer, but only the ones that accepted an offer. But as part of the offer process, I think it would be reasonable to notify centers that a pause had occurred in case they didn't want to have any involvement with that for some reason.
Yeah.
So the obligation here would be, it wouldn't be until it's actually accepted though, right?
The obligation to get the acknowledgement would be at acceptance, yes.
Right.
So that
Thanks.
kind of draws a difference between how we've kind of described it and then ultimately what the policy language says.
Thanks, Darren. Why don't you, in the interest of time, I'm going to move on. to the next person. I would encourage you to kind of write those down and send them because it also would be an opportunity to make sure, areas that are not clarified or could be viewed many ways, we can also incorporate in the implementation materials just to help with both review of matters. So, Jerry.
Thank you. Thank you, PJ, for the work and the terrific presentation and really extremely important issue. My question is actually to John, and I realize we're talking here about pauses in DCD, but I'm curious because this is a public part of our meeting and people are participating. Can you put this in context in terms of what our plans are to just better educate the public of DCD? I feel like there's been this enormous shift that's taken place where we've gone where DCD's become a really important part of the donation system. But I don't think, if you're looking at the general public and their understanding of organ transplantation and donation, I think the vast majority don't understand that this shift has taken place. And I, they're big questions. And so if you could put it more in context of what we're doing, what we have planned to educate the public, how do you have a system where people are primarily signing up to be donors in their motor vehicle department? This is like we're talking about here, how complicated this issue is. There's a need to sort of bring the public along that, if you fall into this category, there is this much more complex part of organ donation that's not rare. It's become almost a primary way in which donors occur.
Yeah, that's a good question. Not ready to actually answer it like this second, but broadly speaking, there is material on all the websites, many of the societies, patient advocacy groups, I think, are another one. The we are I think the best or one of the many approaches is also making sure that people that at the opportunity when it's most relevant, there's the idea of just in time learning and just in time. I think that's really where the robustness needs to happen, which again, I think will be at the OPO hospital level with that particular person. But I think that the HRSA website, the HRSA OPTN website is one approach. But I don't know, Ray or Brianna, if there's any public education grants or funding that are still relevant from the DOT errors in the past or.
I think right now, John, we'll just keep focused, but take the note of interest in public education and how that works moving forward.
But I think, Jerry, your point about making sure we have the all alignment, at least with all the patient groups, the professional societies, peri-adjacent societies that think about this, I think is the best way. I'm not sure we can educating the entire population is both a great idea and a little daunting, but I think mostly the person making the decision at the time really needs to be informed. Millie.
PJ, again, I know everyone has said this, but this really has been a long time coming. Thank you for presenting this. So I have a couple of comments. I do agree entirely with the fact that we have to create some sort of mechanism to educate our hospital partners about DCD so that those staff that are involved at whatever level, whether it's the nursing intern or the nursing student in the ICU, kind of has some understanding of what this process is going to look like. But I would also caution that we absolutely have to preserve the ability of the surgeon who's landing up, quote unquote, at the 11th hour to be able to be part of this unplanned pause. Language I'm hearing now is it's between the physician and the family and potentially OPO who's responsible, but the surgeon absolutely has to be able to show up and say, I'm not comfortable, and be able to halt the process if needed. So is that language going to be in there? How are we going to make sure that that is able to still happen?
I think the language is there now. It states pretty clearly that any of the named stakeholders can call a pause at any of the time, and then the resolution of the pause. I might not, as an OPO leader, I might not put a transplant surgeon in a room with a family and the patient care physician, but I would certainly make sure that the surgeon's concerns were shared with that group, and give the other stakeholders a chance to respond to that, and then share the outcome back with the surgeon, and then the surgeon makes the decision as to whether to proceed or participate or not.
I'm glad you said that, right? Proceed or participate, because certainly if that surgeon is not comfortable with whatever resolution, and I absolutely agree, the surgeon should not be, the recovering surgeon should not be put in a position in a room with a family. That I don't think is going to be something that we're ever going to shoot for. But I do think if they're not comfortable, they should be able to elect not to participate and walk away, leading to delay of OR, etc. It is what it is, but that certainly has to be preserved.
Yeah, I agree. It absolutely has to be preserved, and that may lead to the delay of the OR. It may lead to the patient not being a donor, but that's an important part of the patient safety process, and we intend to preserve that as part of this policy.
No question. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Melly. Steve.
Thanks, PJ. I'm not going to go over a lot which we've discussed before on the NRP, but just I want to throw it out to the group that what I've mentioned in the NRP policy, which would to some degree have to work here in my mind, is that we talk about various authorizations by donor representatives, but there's nothing which states what that authorization looks like. Again, we're not voting here today, and I just want to throw it out so people are aware of it. It's a very simple concept that I think that the authorization has to be put out there to the appropriate party, and it has to be in plain language, in the language of the person who's going to sign the document. And we have to also know that that document will work, that it'll be in writing and it'll be work in all the jurisdictions in the country. Because otherwise we have people will be arguing that we didn't know about this, we didn't have proper information, it wasn't done in accordance with law, etc. Again, we're not here to necessarily discuss this, but I wanted to make sure it was, I know Dr. McGee is aware of this. It's being checked with appropriate counsel, but it's an issue. It's an idea that's not in the policy right now, and I think it probably should be. All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. And just to, again, as I mentioned, the NRP is kind of parallel and will be integrated, but the work in front of us right now will be this comment because it's gone out for public comment. But the idea of an authorization being formally integrated with any DCD donor, which would include a subset of NRP, is something the NRP work group is actively moving forward to. We actually had the last meeting focused specifically on that. So, Ari.
Thank you, PJ. I just want to clarify what seems like a discrepancy to me. Under section 18.5C, the required reporting, it lists the five groups that are supposed to be notified, which includes the patient, the healthcare team, the hospital leadership, OPO, and any transplant programs. But under the unplanned pause section, it doesn't mention the hospital leadership team. It just mentions those people involved with the care of the DCD donor. And I wonder if we should specifically mention that at the time of the unplanned pause.
So you're talking about the stakeholders who can call an unplanned pause?
Well, the people that are involved with it and people who need to be notified, it doesn't say hospital leadership. And the only place it says hospital leadership that I see is when you're notifying the OPTN.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, the intent there was the hospital leadership might not be directly involved in patient care and thus might not be in a position to request a pause. But certainly if they are, they can do so. But it was also the notification part was to ensure that the hospital leadership was aware of the event that had occurred, so that it wasn't something that the OPO and the ICU staff worked through and resolved, but then nobody talked to the hospital leadership about it, so that if the leadership got called out about it later on, they would not be caught unawares.
No, I understand that, but that's the first place that I see it listed is in the notification to the OPTN. It's not listed. That point is not made earlier in this document, as far as I can see.
I think it allows escalation as needed, but it is not mandating it, is my read of it. But PJ.
Certainly isn't forbidden. No, I mean, yeah, I would anticipate that anyone encountering a circumstance like this within their hospital would elevate it to hospital leadership pretty quickly and effectively. But this basically the reporting language requires the OPO to document that they reported the outcome to the hospital leadership. There's
Okay.
just some kind of formal understanding that clearly the OPO has there is clear pathway of communication between the OPO and the donor hospital leadership.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. All right, Sam.
I had a question specific, and I think kind of goes back to Dr. Deborah's point, which I totally agree. I don't think anyone who's uncomfortable with this process should have to be involved. Anyone should be able to recuse themselves at any point. But I guess my question is, were that to be the case, transplant surgeon shows up, they don't agree with the treating team's decision for withdrawal of life-sustaining treatments, family and treating team are like, this is happening, we've deemed this, and the surgeon decides, I'm not going to be involved. We do bring in that additional surgeon because the OPO has decided if that patient's going to be terminally extubated, we'll stand by. And if they pass, still have that donation opportunity. Is that a resolved pause? I'm trying to understand what has to be reported and what doesn't, and what the value of reporting is if, depending on what even requires reporting. I guess I just don't understand what an unresolved pause is, because it's all going to get resolved at some point. It just depends on what that resolution is.
Right. So the circumstance you described, Sam, I would say that is a resolved pause, and one that should be reported. Let me back up. It should be reported because there was conflict in the decision making. Ultimately, we would report the outcome of that conflict, the resolution of that conflict, which is that, in this case, as you described, the hospital and patient family reviewed the circumstances, felt that withdrawal of life-sustaining therapy remained appropriate. I would say the circumstances could vary if there's another surgeon immediately available who is also notified of this pause and agrees that withdrawal of support is acceptable and is willing to participate, then that would happen. Then donation, would happen. If the family and or hospital weren't willing to wait for such a surgeon to arrive, then the withdrawal of life-sustaining therapy might occur without donation happening. And that's how it lands.
And I think important to note, just as an educational thing, because this is being live streamed, what also could happen is they decide to withdraw life-sustaining treatments. The patient does not pass. Donation
Also
doesn't
true.
happen because the patient doesn't die. I think the other really important part of this and with DCD is that DCD donation does not cause a patient to die. Withdrawal of life-sustaining treatments does. And whether or not the patient dies within a certain time frame of that independent decision to withdraw life-sustaining treatments is what then does or does not lead to donation happening. And so donation is entirely dependent on withdrawal of life-sustaining treatments, but withdrawal of life-sustaining treatments and patient's death is not at all related to or dependent upon donation.
Right. And it's not, you're right that it's not a guarantee on any patient that withdrawal of life-sustaining therapy will result in a death in a manner and timing consistent with successful donation.
Yeah, and that speaks to Jerry's, important comment about making sure that we educate as many people as possible, including people that are peri-adjacent to this process. So yeah, you're right, Sam. I think we all know it, but it's easily confused. I'll reserve the last comment to Shelley.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to reiterate, this is not the end of DCD standardization. This is the first step. And for us to create a master policy in one swoop with all the fantastic comments that have been brought up and all the nuances that we have to deal with in DCD can't be accomplished in one setting. So I think this is sort of setting the floor, the basis stuff that some of us may think is pretty standard already, but clearly is not within our community, that we set this and then we continue to build upon it, developing more and more standardizations, more and more clarity with all the other areas that people are talking about. So I think it's important for everyone to know it's not that all the things that are being talked about aren't going to be dealt with, but we have to start somewhere and then build upon it.
Yeah, thanks, Shelley. And that gets to my point about the fact that some of this was directive in nature, and several huge steps forward in this policy, lots to be done. I'd encourage anyone who has comments, either that weren't resolved or have other concerns, to please email PJ and the board support team. There are certainly things that we can, there's implementation work that can adjust and kind of guide some of the concerns. There, a formal revision to the wording of the policy is at this point, we're checking to see what that would require, but we don't plan to sideline all the progress for having to go back to public comment. But thank you everyone for bringing up these points. Again, great role. I think the education part is also really critical. I would ask along those lines, PJ and Doug, we ought to think about formal outreach to like professional societies as a way to make sure that the people know that like this is a thing and what their role in DCD is. So just many different, not everyone watches the OPTN meetings or OPTN webinars or videos. So I think there's several paths to making sure we achieve education. So thank you. Thanks, PJ. Thanks for all the work. The plan will be, this will be brought forward to the board at our next meeting for consideration for approval. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right. The next session is other new business before we move into closed session. Doug, can you
I see no hands raised, Dr. McGee.
Okay. I'm just checking my notes here. With that, I would like to thank the public for attending today's meeting, and the board is now going to move into closed session.